Hello, and welcome to our training on Microsoft Teams Foundations, core components of Microsoft Teams. Additional modules can be found at the link noted at the top of this slide. For feedback on this particular session, you can utilize the AKA MS link/Teams community and adding the IT Pro training label. Additionally, you can provide feedback for this feature through our user voice site. The last bullet of this slide will indicate the current version of this presentation. In this training, we're going to cover a number of core areas that serve as foundational components to Microsoft Teams. This includes starting with the base architecture of Microsoft Teams, and then moving on to look at Azure Active Directory, Office 365 Groups, SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, and Exchange. Let's begin with the architecture of Microsoft Teams. Let's take a look at Teams conversations through a logical architecture. Now, there's a number of components that you can see on this slide. If we start here with the user, notice that the user is capable of doing a number of different functions inside of Microsoft Teams. This includes the ability to chat. Chats themselves take the form of messages as we trace along here, right? Inside of these messages, we would have the capability of placing images if we so desire. I could paste a picture in, for example. That's an inline image, as we see here. But I could also have the opportunity through a one-to-one chat to be able to share a particular file. If I were to share a file from the user's perspective, we would leverage OneDrive for Business for that. Now, in addition to utilizing peer-to-peer and chat-style communications with multiple users, I also have the capability of forming a team. The team architecture, as you can see on the right side here, is actually anchored on a number of components. The first component being the modern group. As we'll see throughout this presentation, the modern group is foundational to utilizing permission services within Teams. In addition, as we create a team, we will also provision a SharePoint site. The SharePoint site maintains a repository for not only content such as news and things of that nature, but also hierarchical folder structure content. This type of content can be aligned to the channels that we create inside of our team. The channels themselves have the capability of mapping to these folders in SharePoint, thus allowing us to have containers for storage of files that we share within the team. But the channels also have the capability of providing a chat mechanism, allowing us to utilize a reply chain mechanism to be able to track threaded conversations within that channel. Also, within a channel, we have the capability of interacting with tabs, which give us some extended capabilities and features within the Teams client. Now, as we step out of the logical architecture and we look at some of the higher level architecture, this slide showcases the various architectural components that are utilized by Microsoft Teams. On the top section here, we see the various types of clients that we have for Microsoft Teams. This includes the web client, which is accessible through our Edge and Chrome browsers, as well as our desktop clients, which are built on top of Electron and also built on top of various calling services, what we often refer to as our next generation calling platform. These desktop applications are both available for the PC as well as the Mac platforms. The next two areas, of course, are the mobile applications that we have on iOS and Android, followed by our Windows app, which is currently in a preview state as of this recording, also known as an HWA or hosted web app. From a client-side perspective, that sums up the various types of Teams clients that we have. If we look at the bottom box here, this showcases the various back-end services that are utilized by Microsoft Teams. Now, we're not going to go through each of these services in great detail, but at the core, Teams services provide middleware access to a number of the features and functions that are available within Office 365. Supporting services such as SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, Exchange, and Azure Active Directory will all be covered in the rest of the training that we have here. There are other services that are noted here that provide additional features and functions available to us, including our chat and presence services, which provide the capability of chat, both peer-to-peer as well as multi-party and channel chat services. Our next generation calling platform, which provides our audio video services, not only conferencing, but also connectivity to the phone system environment. We have the ability to extend Teams with our connectors. In our backend service here, we have a component called our Firehose listener, which is responsible for sending information into our notification hubs, as well as being able to push information through our email service via SMTP, which we typically will utilize for mail notifications. But the Firehose listener can also be used for e-discovery components, something that we can discuss in a much deeper session when we look at e-discovery and compliance. Let's take a look at Azure Active Directory and how it relates to Microsoft Teams. Azure Active Directory, or AAD, as it's commonly referred, is Microsoft's multi-tenant cloud-based directory and our identity management service. Azure AD combines the core directory services components that we utilize for Microsoft Teams, as well as provides a mechanism for application access management and identity protection into this singular solution. In the on-premises world, we typically refer to this as our directory service or Windows Server Active Directory. In the cloud, this is known as Azure Active Directory. It is possible for organizations to leverage both on-premises Active Directory as well as the cloud Azure Active Directory through a synchronization mechanism. At the end of the day, this is going to provide our multi-tenant cloud-based directory and identity management services for Microsoft Teams. Azure Active Directory comes in multiple editions. The free edition is included with an Azure subscription. Azure AD Basic is typically used by task workers that often have cloud-first needs. So it provides the capability of doing typical group-based management tasks, self-service password reset for various cloud applications, as well as the ability to utilize what's known as an Azure AD application proxy. This application proxy provides the ability for an organization to publish an on-premises web application while utilizing the features and functions available in Azure AD. Azure AD also has two premium SKUs available, Premium P1 and Premium P2. The Premium P1 SKU provides additional enterprise-level identity management capabilities, such as the ability to utilize dynamic groups, as well as the ability to provide self-service group management to our end users. The Premium P2 SKU adds the identity protection and privileged identity management components on top of what already exists inside of our P1 features. The link that you see on the slide here takes you to a detailed feature matrix of all of the various editions of Azure Active Directory. Let's take a look at the identity models that are used with Microsoft Teams. When we look at an identity model, it can fall into one of three classifications. The first being a cloud identity. A cloud identity is a user that is created and managed entirely within Office 365. The account is stored in Azure Directory, and the password is verified by Azure Active Directory itself. A synchronized identity is a user identity that is managed and created in the on-premises server environment, what we refer to as Active Directory. The accounts and password hashes themselves are synchronized to the Office 365 cloud. A federated identity requires that we have a synchronized identity, so the user object is created in the on-premises server environment, but synchronized to the cloud, much like we saw in the synchronized identity. The difference here is the password itself is verified by the on-premises identity provider. In most cases, this would be Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS. Let's take a deeper look at the identity models and the corresponding components that are utilized by these identity models. As you can see on the left, when we look at a cloud identity, because the cloud identity is created and managed entirely within Office 365, there are no on-premises servers that are required for this type of identity. If I look at an Office 365 synchronized identity, in this case, as you recall, the synchronized identity is created and managed in the on-premises directory environment, typically Active Directory. This is then synchronized via directory sync mechanism with the password sync, or what we refer to as a password hash sync, to Azure Active Directory. So in this case, we would require the ability to manage and maintain the directory on premises. So I would need Windows servers with Active Directory. We would then also have to synchronize this utilizing a tool such as Azure AD Connect. Now this does provide a single sign-on experience for us. However, there are by definition two directories to maintain. The on-premises identity directory, which exists in Windows Server Active Directory, and the synchronized directory, which exists up here in Azure Active Directory. This type of solution typically requires a couple of servers in the on-premises environment. A federated identity also leverages an on-premises directory component, much as we saw in our synchronized identity stage. But remember, the difference here is from a federated identity standpoint, we're not actually synchronizing the password hash to Azure AD. Rather, we are going to utilize the on-premises environment to authenticate the user. In this instance, we see that this is a federated identity connection. So we still have a directory sync component in play, typically Azure AD Connect, but we would then need another component that would be able to provide the services needed for checking the user's credentials. That would typically be Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS, and this type of solution typically requires a large number of servers, especially since high availability would be paramount in this type of architecture. When we synchronize the identities to the cloud, we will typically utilize a tool such as Azure AD Connect. This free tool provided by Microsoft enables common identities between the on-premises Active Directory environment and the online Azure Active Directory environment. Synchronization happens securely over the internet, and we even provide an express settings setup to get you on your way as quickly as possible. If it's necessary, you can go into our custom setup for more complex scenarios, such as a multi-forest topology, a scenario where you may need to do filtering of which accounts are synchronized into the directory, if you want to configure what we call SSO or single sign-on, and so forth. That is all capable through the custom setup options that we have within Azure AD Connect. The Azure AD Connect tool will also allow us to set up sign-in using either the password synchronization or the federation that we have with ADFS. So this tool can be used for both our synchronized identities and our federated identities. When I synchronize my identities with password sync, from a user's perspective, they only know a single identity, a single username, and a single password. The fact that there are multiple directories on the back end and synchronization is happening is completely transparent to the end user. Authentication typically happens in the cloud, but it could happen in an on-premises environment, depending on if we used an Azure AD proxy that would allow us to provide authentication for the on-premises environment. As we mentioned, in this case, the users happen to have two IDs in two different directories, but it all culminates as a single username and password combination, so it's transparent to the end user. From an administrative perspective, if synchronization is happening properly, typically there's nothing to maintain for the cloud identity itself. All the maintenance and management is done for the on-premises side, and Azure AD Connect takes care of the synchronization for you. When we look at the user experience from a federated identity standpoint, in this scenario, the users would sign in with their corporate ID, much as they would expect because this is in on-premises Active Directory. The authentication will happen via the on-premises environment utilizing what we call a claims-based system. Users will have a single credential to provide single sign-on, whether it's an on-premises service that they're utilizing or an online service. So in this particular scenario, whether the user is accessing an on-premises application or whether they're accessing a cloud service such as Exchange Online, they will get a true single sign-on experience and only need to utilize their single username and password. From an administrative perspective, it's a little bit more complicated when we have a federated scenario because we have a number of components at play, including ADFS. We would manage our password policy on premises only because that's really where the authentication is happening from a federated identity perspective. Password resets would work for the on-premises IDs as well, because again, that's where the authentication is happening. And there are some additional servers that are required to enable this identity federation. And again, if we want high availability, we're going to need to have some redundancy in these servers as well. So that's an additional upfront cost to consider if we leverage the federated identity experience. How does Teams leverage Azure Active Directory? We utilize Azure AD as our identity mechanism to provide single sign-on with our Office 365 applications. As part of Azure AD, we can also leverage multi-factor authentication to provide an additional level of security, such that when a user logs into their account, we require an additional token, for example, maybe a device or something of that nature, to allow them to gain access to the service. We also have the capability of providing conditional access, such that they can utilize our application, but only from a particular location or a particular device state, such as a device that's managed by Intune, for example. We also have the capability of providing access reviews, which is currently in preview as of the time of this recording. Access reviews allow us to provide some attestation for the guest users that are gaining access to our Teams environment and ensure that those folks still require that level of access, and if not, we can remove them from the system. There's some advanced modern group features that are leveraged as part of Azure AD as well. That includes naming policies and group expiration. But we'll cover these in a little bit more detail in the next section when we talk about modern groups. Let's talk about how Office 365 groups are leveraged by Microsoft Teams. Office 365 groups themselves is commonly referred to as a membership service. As we follow the steps that we see on the slide here, a user can create a new group for collaborative purposes, utilizing a number of different applications. As you can see on the slide here, we showcase Outlook, Teams, Yammer, SharePoint, and Groups itself. So there are different applications that you can use to create groups. We'll get into that in a little bit. But as the user creates this new group for collaboration, a group identity is then created in Azure Active Directory to represent this particular classification or collection of users. This group has an identity, various resource URLs, owners, and members, all of which we're going to get into over the coming slides here. The group experience will then be populated in the application of choice for the end user. So again, we have a number of applications that we have listed here. In this presentation, we're going to focus on utilizing Microsoft Teams for creating new groups, as well as the group experience. Groups themselves provide a singular identity inside of Azure AD. This is the master for the group identity and membership across all of the services that will leverage this particular underlying group. That includes Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, and so forth. We also have the capability with these groups to extend our services to federated resources. The groups themselves provide what we call loose coupling between the various services, such that the various services will notify each other of changes relative to the group, such as creation of items, deletion of items, and so forth. As we get a little bit deeper into the deck, we'll see how that impacts Microsoft Teams. As mentioned on the previous slide, when you're provisioning Office 365 groups, from an end user perspective, any user by default has the capability of creating a new group. We can create it through a number of different applications as well, whether it's Outlook, through PowerShell, utilizing the new unified group command, which builds on top of our Microsoft Graph API. You can do this from SharePoint Online when you create a new team site, from Microsoft Teams when you create a new team, or from various other applications and integrations that we have inside of Office 365. From an administrative standpoint, of course, we have the ability to control who can create groups, but by default, anyone can create a new group inside of Office 365. When an Office 365 group is created, a set of resources will become available by default. Now, it's important to realize that depending on the application that's being used, that will determine the set of resources that become available when the group is created. For example, if I were to utilize Outlook to create a new modern group, I would get access to a set of resources that include the shared inbox, calendar, a SharePoint document library, a OneNote notebook, as well as a SharePoint team site. Conversely, if I were to use Yammer to create the modern group, I would get the corresponding SharePoint document library, OneNote notebook, and team site, but instead of having access to an inbox and shared calendar, I would utilize a Yammer group, which makes sense since I would be utilizing the Yammer application. Now, a little later in this presentation, we'll take a look at what happens when we utilize Teams to create an Office 365 group. When we add members to the underlying Office 365 group, that will automatically give them the permissions that they need to access the resources that the particular group will provide. So for example, if I were to create an Office 365 group and it included a SharePoint document library, the members of that Office 365 group would automatically have access to the documents that are contained within that SharePoint document library. When I create an Office 365 group, there are various roles that I can assign upon the creation and management of the group. First and foremost being, of course, an owner. The person who creates the group, of course, by default is the owner, and the owners effectively act as moderators for the group, meaning they have the capability to add and remove members from the group, as well as the ability to go and delete conversations from the various mechanisms that we have inside the group itself, whether it's the persistent chat workspace that we have inside of Teams, or the conversations that we have inside of Outlook. The owners also have the ability to manage the various group settings, rename the group, change various other parameters that we have of the group itself. Effectively, the owners have full reign over the group itself. Members, on the other hand, are simply regular users in the organization that would utilize the group to collaborate. So they have the ability to access whatever the group has to offer, but they can't go in and change the settings for the group. As we put members into the Office 365 group, they are added as site members for the corresponding SharePoint site that is created upon the time that the group is created. Now, lastly, we have the option of creating what are called guests, or having a role, I should say, of what we call guests inside of Office 365 groups. These are similar to members in the sense that they have access to items that are in a group. However, these are users that are outside of your organization. Now, an admin has the ability to control if guests are permitted in groups or not, but the guests themselves would typically take on many of the same responsibilities that a member would. However, the user is from outside of your organization. Groups themselves have two different privacy levels, public and private. By definition, a public group can be seen by anyone in your organization, right? So the word public here is a little bit of a misnomer. It's essentially public inside of your org. It's not public to everyone in the world, simply public inside of your organization. And by virtue of it being public, anyone in your organization would be able to join the group. Conversely, a private group contains content that can be only seen by the members of the group itself. And if you would like to join this particular private group, you will have to be approved by one of the group's owners. As we mentioned earlier, neither public nor private groups can be accessed by people outside of the organization by default. If you want someone outside of your organization to access these groups, either public or private, you would need to specifically invite them as guests. So how does Teams fit into all this? We can utilize the Teams client, as you see in the screenshot in the top right, to create a new team. And actually under the hood, when we create this new team, we are going to provision a corresponding Office 365 group. Now this group will get a number of resources as we have seen before, including the calendar, the SharePoint document library, the OneNote, the team site, and a persistent chat-based workspace that can be leveraged from within the Teams application itself. Membership will be synchronized between the underlying group and Teams. If you were to add a member to the underlying group directly, that would then replicate over to Microsoft Teams so that they would have access to the various resources that we have inside of Teams itself, such as the persistent chat-based workspace, for example. If you were to add a distribution list to the team, we will perform a one-time expansion of that distribution list and invite the individual members of that distribution list as it was at that particular moment. Dynamic membership is in fact supported for Office 365 groups. However, Teams does not yet support dynamic membership. So if you were to add dynamic membership or configure that for your Office 365 group, this would not currently be replicated to Microsoft Teams. So how does Teams leverage Office 365 groups? Well, as we know, groups provide a membership service. Microsoft Teams will utilize that member service as the access control list to the Files and Notes tab. The Files tab being a connection to SharePoint, the online document library that's provisioned at the time that we create the team. Owners of existing groups that have been created prior to the introduction of Microsoft Teams can add the Teams functionality to the underlying Office 365 group. Team creation settings are controlled through the administrative portal where you control group creation settings. Now, as we'll see in a couple of slides, there's a couple of different places we can go to administer various settings for groups themselves, including the Azure Active Directory portal, as well as settings that we can do inside of Teams itself. Now, there are some considerations you have to take into account when you are planning for Teams and the corresponding groups. First, as we mentioned, Teams will leverage a number of settings from the underlying group itself. This includes not only membership, but also features such as naming policies and group expiration. Now, naming policies is just as it sounds, the ability for us to predict or determine how we are going to follow the naming structure for groups. Now, we do need an Azure AD P1 license for each unique user that's a member of one of these groups to leverage the naming policies feature. We also have group expiration, which is the ability for us to put a time box around how long a group can live, essentially, giving the users, of course, options to renew as necessary, but then allowing groups to then expire based on a predetermined time frame. As mentioned, an Azure AD P1 license is needed for group expiration as well, and we do need a license for all users that are members of groups to which the expiration policy will be applied. Now, when we administer groups, there's technically 3 different areas that we can go to deal with the administration of groups. The first being the admin center, which allows us to provide basic management, who are the owners, who are the members, and so forth. We also have the Azure Active Directory portal, where we go to configure some more advanced services such as the self-service configuration, our group expiration, and group auditing. Lastly, we do have PowerShell commandlets that we can use, and currently the naming policy configuration is configured through the PowerShell commandlets that we have as part of the preview. I've also listed on this slide a couple of considerations that are specific to Exchange. These are a couple of good items to go and take a look at as supplemental material to how we leverage groups within Teams and their dependency on Exchange, but we'll talk a little bit more about Exchange as we move later in the deck. Let's take a quick look at where some of these resources show up inside of the Teams client itself. Now, we had mentioned earlier that when we utilize the Teams client to provision a team, which in turn provisions an underlying Office 365 group, that one of the resources that it establishes for us is the ability to use a persistent chat-based workspace. You see here in the screenshot that this surfaces as the Conversations tab within the channel inside of the team. As we provision a team, another resource that is provisioned on the back end is a SharePoint document library. This is actually surfaced in the Teams client as the Files tab. As I look at the Files tab here, you'll notice that I see a listing of folders and files, very much like I would expect to see if I were looking at a SharePoint website. In fact, I have the capability, if I click the Open in SharePoint link, to pop out to a browser, and I will see the familiar SharePoint document library view inside of my web browser here. This is the same view that you see from inside of the Microsoft Teams client. Let's take a look at the foundational components of SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business with respect to Microsoft Teams. Teams will use SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business to store files that a user will share within the Teams experience. Now, as noted in our section on Office 365 Groups, when I establish and create a team, we create an underlying Office 365 group, which also provisions a modern SharePoint team site as part of that group provisioning process. If we were to create a team with the same name as a site that already exists, the SharePoint URL would be modified to include a GUID. Probably a good reason to adhere to some of our O365 group naming policies to ensure that we don't allow that to happen. A resource that we provision with the Office 365 group is the Team OneNote that is stored in SharePoint Online. You then have the capability inside of Teams to add tabs for any of the corresponding SharePoint resources that are made available as part of the modern SharePoint site. So this could include a SharePoint page, a SharePoint list, a news section, or even a single document from the document library. You also have the ability to establish a connector for news articles from SharePoint to post within Teams. A great way to showcase the collaborative aspects that we have for our Hub for Teamwork. So what are some of the advantages to storing files in SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business with Microsoft Teams? Well, first, we have the capability of leveraging our co-authoring and online versions of our Office applications. Additionally, we have some available data governance and compliance features already built in to both SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, such as automatic classification, DLP, e-discovery, encryption, retention, and so forth, all of which we can take advantage of through our Microsoft Teams experience. We have best-in-class mobile experiences with Teams, SharePoint, and Office apps on both iOS and Android. We have the capability of previewing over 270 file types, allowing me to continue to work within context of my Teams application without having to jump out to open up yet another type of application. Since my files are stored inside of SharePoint and OneDrive, they are accessible to Delve and SharePoint Search, both of which will respect the corresponding file permissions that are set. We do have a OneDrive sync client available both for Windows and Mac that allows us to easily synchronize any of the files that are established for our team and allow me to take them offline and go do what I need to do. We will respect any tenant SharePoint and OneDrive for Business settings and locations with regards to how we leverage them within Microsoft Teams. Now, when I look at the integration of SharePoint and OneDrive for Business inside of the Teams application, one of the first areas I want to look at is files in Teams. And here in this screenshot, you can see I happen to be inside of my X1050 launch team, my go-to-market plan channel, and I have the capability of clicking over to my Files tab. This Files tab will be displayed in every channel in the team. The files themselves are stored in the corresponding SharePoint Online site that is associated to the underlying Office 365 group. This is what's commonly referred to as a document library in SharePoint vernacular. If I were to chat with another individual user, simply having a one-to-one chat, and I were to share a file in that instance, files in chat are located in the sender's OneDrive for Business. Now, the cool thing about the way that Teams is structured is the end user doesn't even need to know, is it in SharePoint or is it in OneDrive? They just simply need to interact with the Teams application and share files as they see fit. We'll take care of the back end and understanding where it goes, whether it's in SharePoint or whether it's in OneDrive. You always have the opportunity, especially as we're navigating through our Teams interface on our Files tab to click the Open in SharePoint link, which will then open your corresponding browser and give you access to the full SharePoint web experience. Why would I want to do that? Well, this would also provide me the capability of breaking out to the full SharePoint experience and exposing other items such as the sync button that would allow me to then synchronize this document library utilizing my OneDrive client. Now, natively, we will store files in SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, but Teams also provides the ability to add additional cloud storage providers. These additional cloud storage providers can be added inside channels within a team, and they include Dropbox, Box, ShareFile, Google Drive, and the ability to add an additional SharePoint Online library. From a process perspective, when a user clicks over to the Files tab, if there is an additional cloud storage provider listed, they will then need to sign in to that cloud provider and select which folder or folders that they would like to share. Once we've signed in to that cloud provider, those documents will then be displayed as folders within the file view. So as you can see in our screenshot here, I have a home folder. That's the home folder that happens to be on our additional cloud storage provider. You do not have the ability to substitute usage of SharePoint or OneDrive for Business as the native file experience inside of Teams. As we utilize SharePoint and OneDrive for Business for file storage, there is a specific file structure that we need to be aware of. From a SharePoint perspective, when we create the team, which creates the corresponding Office 365 group, which in turn creates the corresponding modern team site, we will create a document library, which in turn will have a folder for each channel. Now, obviously, when you first create that particular team, we're only going to have a single channel, which is general. But as I add additional channels into my team, we will create the corresponding folders inside of the document library. So as you can see on the right-hand side, I've created a team, aptly known as Team 1. My general channel is created by default, and as such, in my document library, I will have a corresponding folder named General. But as I create additional channels, Channel 1, Channel 2, and so forth, I will get a corresponding folder created inside of that document library. By default, all the channels and folders will inherit the permissions of the underlying Office 365 group. But because this is simply a SharePoint document library on the back end, you have the full capability of utilizing all of the administrative tools that SharePoint has to offer. So you can change the underlying permissions as needed, and Teams will in fact respect that. In OneDrive for Business, when we share files in one-to-one chats or one-to-multi-person chats, private chats as we call them, the files themselves will be placed in a folder of the sender called Microsoft Teams chat files. So when I go to chat with someone and I share a file, we will actually upload that file to the OneDrive of the person that wants to share it, share that particular file out, and set the unique permissions as necessary based on the person or people in the chat. So what happens if I don't happen to have SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business? Perhaps my organization is all deployed on premises with SharePoint and I don't have online yet, or we've simply chosen for compliance reasons or what have you to turn off OneDrive for Business. SharePoint Online is a prerequisite for OneDrive for Business. Without SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business, you actually will still be able to store and share files within the channels themselves. However, private file sharing, which is in chat, that will not work if you have not enabled OneDrive for Business. You will see the screenshot that we have here. Sorry, you need OneDrive for Business to be able to do file sharing. Let's take a look at a specific situation of a customer that doesn't have SharePoint Online. The Teams implementation will respect your investment in SharePoint Online. There are some things to consider. First and foremost, if I don't have SharePoint Online today, is it because I have SharePoint on premises, And as such, should any content that is on premises be migrated into SharePoint Online. Note that this is not a requirement to be able to start utilizing Teams, but it's something that you should consider. How are my sites and documents going to be classified and secured? How do we govern our compliance? How do we configure the Security and Compliance Center? What about external access? The ability to control who can create SharePoint sites, what kinds of sites, custom site designs, right? All of these considerations need to be taken into account as we look to leverage SharePoint Online. And in fact, these are a number of questions that will typically come up for organizations prior to utilizing Microsoft Teams to ensure that they understand how we're going to leverage SharePoint Online. If you need some assistance with this, of course, you can reach out to our Fast Track folks or our partner resources to help you understand how to approach these particular service decisions. Let's take a look at some terminology specific to SharePoint. In SharePoint, we have two types of sites. We have classic sites and modern sites. On the left-hand side, you can see a screenshot here of a typical classic team site inside of SharePoint. Now, the classic team sites themselves really evolved from back in the SharePoint 2003 days. So they weren't really built with mobile in mind. They weren't built with collaboration in mind. They did have the capability of allowing some deep branding and doing some great web content management experiences, but they're not really built around the new collaborative experience that we want to empower inside of Microsoft Teams, for example. If we look on the right-hand side, you see an example of a modern team site. Now, the modern team sites are built on an all-new client-side architecture that is designed from the ground up for collaboration. When I build a new Office 365 group, or whether I create that with the native Office 365 group tools themselves, or I utilize Microsoft Teams to create a team, which creates a corresponding group, I will get a modern SharePoint team site built for me automatically. You do have the capability of modernizing existing team sites. So what that basically means is taking an existing team site inside of SharePoint and adding group functionality to it, which then allows us to teamify that group, if you will, and add the team features on top of that as well. When we compare classic SharePoint to modern SharePoint sites, one thing that comes up quite readily is the fact that in a classic SharePoint site, we would have a hierarchical structure where sites were arranged within site collections of each other. We would have sites and sub-sites and lists and so on and so forth. That made it very difficult to move a site into a new collection. If we had any kind of reorg or acquisition, it was very painful to restructure the classic SharePoint sites. In contrast, modern SharePoint Online prefers a flat architecture, such that each site collection that we create just has a single site. Hub sites are then used to organize the site collections and could provide a hierarchy if necessary. Since Teams uses both SharePoint and OneDrive for Business for files, we should understand the impact of storage. OneDrive for Business will allocate 1 terabyte per user by default. SharePoint will allocate 1 terabyte for the organization plus an additional 10 gig per user, unless of course you are utilizing an F1 license as noted below. Additional storage can be purchased as needed, and administrators have the ability to configure quotas, such to limit the size of a particular SharePoint site. Let's talk about what to configure where when we're looking at teams and groups in SharePoint. When I go to add members, the general recommendation here is to do that through the Teams interface or the Teams tools. This will ensure that it takes effect both for teams as well as the corresponding group. There are some situations where if you were to perform the operation through just the underlying group itself, it may not reflect in Teams. For example, if I were to use dynamic group membership, or I were to say add a guest user through the Azure AD portal into the underlying group, that may not reflect itself properly within Teams. If we need to promote a member to owner status, we can do that either through the underlying group mechanism or through Teams, and that will reflect appropriately in both situations. This is extremely useful if you happen to lose all of your owners of a particular team. You can simply go into the Azure AD portal and promote that user, and within a matter of minutes, that would show up within Teams. If you're to change the channel or folder name, if I were to go within Teams and go to a channel and rename it, the channel will show the new name, but the corresponding folder that we're linked to in the underlying document library would keep the old name. If you were to do the inverse of that and go into SharePoint and change the folder name itself, that will break the integration to Teams. And that means when you go into the underlying channel and click on the Files tab, you'll actually be presented with an error because the underlying folder has been renamed. Changing file permissions for members is not really something you can do within the Teams interface. Teams will completely respect the permissions that you have set in SharePoint, but we don't have a mechanism to go inside of Teams currently and change any of the file permissions. You can, of course, go and change the permissions inside of SharePoint itself, and that will reflect itself and be respected accordingly inside of Teams. You can utilize SharePoint pages from within the Teams application. This will work with modern pages, lists, news, even whole documents. And we do this by going into our Teams application, in this case going into a channel, and adding a new tab. Existing team sites can be used as the basis for teams that you are going to create. SharePoint Online site administrators will have an option when they create a new team inside of Teams to utilize an existing SharePoint site. The file section will be empty as Teams itself uses a specific folder mapping per channel. You would then have the ability to add any files that are in an existing document library via the Add a Tab option, which is in the screenshot that we have here, the little plus sign that we see up here. That's the ability for us to add a tab. From there, I can select SharePoint and I'd have the capability of being able to add an additional document library as necessary. It is also possible to integrate SharePoint Online Classic site pages, but you will need to connect the Classic site with a new Office 365 group. There is a SharePoint modernization scanner that you can use to verify if the site itself can be connected to an Office 365 group. Not all Classic sites would have the capability of being connected to an Office 365 group. Currently, this is available in PowerShell, utilizing the set-spo site Office 365 group commandlet. The site collection administrator can create the new group via the settings menu in this Classic team site once we determine that it's possible for us to connect this to an Office 365 group. Let's talk about Microsoft Exchange. So how will Microsoft Teams utilize Exchange? A first area where Teams uses Exchange is for compliance. Now, if you think back in our architecture discussion, you'll remember that when we look at chats, there is actually a chat service that is utilized inside of Office 365. Additionally, we have a component called our Office 365 substrate, which can pull the chats through the substrate and into a corresponding Exchange mailbox. This will be the home for chats when we access them through our compliance features in our compliance portal. Teams will also use Exchange for storing meeting information. As I go to schedule new meetings and so forth, that will be maintained on the user's calendar inside of their Exchange mailbox. We use Exchange to change the user profile picture, call history, voicemail, connector configuration as well. Now, we fully support Exchange Online, of course, but there are limited feature sets that are available with Exchange Server on premises or Exchange Online dedicated. We've got a slide coming up on that in just a few minutes. If you do have Exchange on-premises hosted users, as mentioned, there is limited feature support available, but we do need to ensure that Exchange on-premises is configured in a hybrid mode. Here we see an Exchange feature matrix that details what features are available based on where the user's mailbox is hosted. So for example, the first two rows showcase a user's mailbox being hosted in Exchange Online and Exchange Online dedicated vNext. In both of these platforms, all of the features that we have in the table are available. If users are hosted in Exchange Online Dedicated Legacy or Exchange On-Premises, you will see a number of features that are not currently supported between Microsoft Teams and Exchange. As mentioned earlier, we want to ensure that our Exchange environment is configured in hybrid to work with Microsoft Teams. The requirements we have for configuring Exchange Hybrid include setting up AAD Connect with writeback. This will make the groups that we create in Office 365 available for on-premises users. Remember, Office 365 Groups are only available in the online service. Now, as a prerequisite, we need an Azure AD Premium license to be able to configure writeback. We do need to configure hybrid, and we need a minimum of the following versions that you see on the slide. As mentioned earlier, Teams will utilize Exchange for e-discovery purposes. E-discovery is always done against Exchange Online. That's where the e-discovery portal is, and that's really where all of our data is from a Teams perspective. Now, there's two types of messages that we have inside of Teams from a chat perspective. That's channel messages that happen inside of the team in the channel itself, and chat messages, which could be a one-to-one or a one-to-many, but in a private chat type scenario. Now, by default, as we remember from our architecture discussion earlier in this training, there is a chat service that runs inside of Office 365. This is the primary service that the Teams client will interact with for channel messages and chat messages. But as part of e-discovery, we will actually pull these messages or journal these messages through our Office 365 substrate into a final resting place for e-discovery. And from a channel message perspective, that final resting place is the corresponding mailbox of the group that was established when we created the team. Individual user chat messages will need to be stored in the corresponding user's mailbox as a final resting place for e-discovery. Now, of course, if the user is homed in Exchange Online, we will simply use their Exchange Online mailbox. But if the user has their mailbox in Exchange On-Premises, out of the box, we don't have a mechanism to provide e-discovery support for those on-premises mailboxes. In order to allow an on-premises mailbox to be searched through the e-discovery toolsets, we need a cloud equivalent of their mailbox specifically for chat e-discovery. This is currently available in preview as a feature that can be enabled via our support processes. Once support has enabled this particular feature, we'll create a cloud equivalent mailbox for the on-premises user and use it specifically for chat, thus allowing us to journal the messages from the chat service through the fire hose into this now cloud equivalent mailbox for my on-premises user. I can then run e-discovery queries and I'll be able to gain access to the chats of this particular user even though his corresponding mailbox is actually on premises. Now, of course, if you're in the midst of a migration and you then migrate the user's on-premises mailbox to online, all of that content will still remain intact because we'll simply merge the cloud equivalent mailbox that we utilized specifically for chat with the user's actual mailbox that is migrated to online. Another piece that we'll utilize with Exchange Server is voicemail. Now, voicemail in and of itself isn't actually provided by Exchange. Voicemail for Teams is actually provided by Azure Voicemail. But users are typically going to be notified and receive a copy of their voicemail in their Exchange mailbox. So that means that we have to have a mechanism to allow Azure Voicemail to deposit the voicemail message into a particular mailbox. Now, of course, if this happens to be a user with an Exchange Online mailbox, then no additional configuration is required. But if we're using Exchange on premises or Exchange Server, at a bare minimum, we need to have Exchange 2013 with the latest CU applied. We need to open up the ability to connect to Exchange Web Services or EWS, which means that we need the appropriate firewall ports open for us to reach this from the internet with the corresponding DNS records. We do need to make sure we have directory synchronization already taken care of. For more information on that, refer back to our Azure AD section of this training. We need to configure OAuth, which is an authorization mechanism between the Office 365 service and the on-premises server platform. And although we don't use Exchange UM, we do need an Exchange UM license assigned. So users with the Exchange on-premises do in fact need Exchange Online Plan 2 licenses assigned, but we're not actually going to utilize Exchange UM. What happens if we run into a situation where we have some unsupported features? For example, perhaps I looked at that matrix that we saw earlier and I realized that there was something in there that came up with a big red no that says, oh, well, based on where the user's mailbox is, I'm not going to have the capability of doing such and such. Right? One example of that is Teams meetings. Right? You could get into a situation where you are unable to actually create a new Teams meeting through the Teams client because your mailbox is homed on Exchange on premises. The workaround to that is to be able to utilize currently on Windows PCs the Teams add-in for Outlook, and shortly the ability to do the same on your Mac. The meeting invites will be on your calendar across platform. So that's an easy way to work around the inability to create a Teams meeting from inside of the Teams client itself. Another limitation we saw is the ability to change your profile picture, which is not available if you're utilizing an Exchange on-premises mailbox. You do have a workaround for that where you can simply go to the Office 365 portal and change your profile picture there. We will then show that profile picture inside of the Teams client. Connectors. You can create connectors inside of the Teams application. However, when your mailbox is on premises, you won't have the ability to configure these particular connectors. So you can use them. Other folks can add connectors into the team for you, and you'll be able to utilize them, but you can't configure them when you have an on-premises mailbox. Let's take a look at a summary of what we've covered in this foundational training for Microsoft Teams. Teams builds on top of Office 365 services. For an optimal user experience, we need to ensure that we leverage Azure Active Directory and any synchronization mechanisms that may be necessary, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and Exchange Online. If we don't have all of these components, we can still utilize Teams, but there will be some limited functionality available as we covered throughout this course. Thank you for attending this foundational training for Microsoft Teams.